I'm Arland Thornton, a longtime member of the Institute for Social Research, the Sociology Department, and the Native American Studies program here at the University of Michigan. I'm so glad that you could join us on this installment of the ISR Insights Speaker Series. The goal of our speaker series is to disseminate research findings of ISR faculty. During today's presentation, a team of researchers from the University of Michigan and the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians Archive and Records Department will discuss the land and schooling of the Anishinaabe, an important Native group here in the Great Lakes region. Please note that we are providing live captioning of this event, and you can view those captions by turning on the closed captioning feature on your screen. Also, we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions through the Q&A feature throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them before our time ends. A recording of today's presentation will be posted on the ISR website later on. I'll begin by introducing the rest of our team. I'll begin with Eric Hemenway. Eric is an Anishinaabe Odawa. He's the Director of Archives and Records at the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Harbor Springs, Michigan. Linda Young-DeMarco is a longtime member of the Survey Research Center here at the Institute for Social Research. Alphonse Pitawanakwat is an Odawa member of the Wiikemkoong First Nation unceded territory in Ontario, Canada. He's a lecturer in American culture and Native American studies at the University of Michigan. Lindsey Willow Smith is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. She's a member of the University of Michigan graduating class of 2022, receiving her bachelor's here in a few weeks in history and museum studies. There are many dimensions of Native American schooling to study. There's an extensive literature on boarding schools that documents the separation of children from families and communities, documents coercion and abuse, high rates of morbidity and mortality, and suppression of Native identities, language, and beliefs. There's new information came out from Canada last year, which refocused attention on boarding schools. The Department of the Interior in the US has launched a new study, and they're going to collect records about schools and student enrollment, identity and protection of school sites and burial grounds. That focus on boarding schools is important and useful. And we are going to be looking at Native schooling through a different lens. Our project, our contribution is going to come from the social science and population studies. We're going to describe the origins and growth of Native schools, the types of Native schools, the expansion of Native student enrollment. We'll describe literacy and school attainment levels and trends. We'll use very broad data, the United States decennial censuses, the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and school records. So our goal was the historical sociology and demography of Anishinaabe schooling. And so in doing that, we'll provide an overview of the nation's national growth of schools, literacy, and school attainment. And we'll also do an overview of the growth of schools, literacy, and school attainment of the Anishinaabe people of Wagon Xing which is in northwest Michigan. Our plan of our outline of our presentation will be to outline first the who is an Anishinaabe, the geography of the Anishinaabe. Third will be the national school program comes to the Anishinaabe. Next will be the Anishinaabe school attainment and literacy. Then we'll talk about schools and school attendance. And then we'll do our conclusions. So Alphonse Pitawanakwat is going to talk for a few minutes about who is an Anishinaabe. Go ahead, Eric. Next slide.
Who are the Anishinaabek? The Anishinaabe are a group of culturally related indigenous people present in the Great Lakes region of Canada and the United States. They make up the Three Fires Confederation of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. Anishinaabe refers to a single man, which is a southwestern Ojibwe word. The word begins with a vowel. And the meaning that comes out of that word is a word meaning the people are lowered to earth, a meaning given by the Western Ojibwe. Anishinaabe, a southeastern Ojibwe word, also means a single Anishinaabe, a single man, but I get a different meaning out of it. Nisha means he or she is good. Nabe, a human form or a man or a being, means Nabe, which comes from a combination word of Nishnaabe, a good being. Anishinaabe is a language spoken by the Anishinaabek. Now here is land acknowledgement. Anishinaabe abit nukiot temgat manda Michigan Chickenomagegamik dasun chosle dasu shinish wasui gin subbonga Ojibwe Odawa Minopodwadmik we bagimi gwena mamunchini benak Chickenomagegamgong Wipiga Antbiga dek Chickeno Chinakunigewen Deben Dang Mandake Mompini Sadrun Kewi no Nijatsu on Chickenomagasnet. Tapanaming nenda Kidwinan, me waminoga vanko sejikshenda, a king meno, Kimiguat Chickenomaregam gong, is apanigade, meno, squanjagade. And this is the English translation of that. The University of Michigan was founded through the Treaty of Fort Meigs in 1817, when the Anishinaabe the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations, ceded portions of their land so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their ancestral, traditional, and contemporary ties to the land and the founding of the university are renewed and reaffirmed.
Thank you, Alphonse. I'm going to begin. Next slide, Eric. I'm sorry. My discussion of Anishinaabe geography will be very general and brief. I will start with a one-time snapshot of a 1768 baseline map of natives in the Great Lakes region that was prepared by Helen Hornbeck Tanner. Next slide, Eric. The white areas on this map represent the Great Lakes, while the other colors designate the numerically predominant native groups on the land. The gray area surrounding Lake Superior represents one group of Ojibwe Anishinaabe. The green area surrounding most of Lake Huron and along the northern shores of Lake Ontario and Erie represent a second group of Ojibwe Anishinaabe. The blue area in the western half of today's Michigan, also in northwest Ohio and on the north edges of Lake Michigan and Huron, represent the Odawa or Odawa Anishinaabe. The pinkish area in the southern part of today's Michigan and around the southern part of Lake Michigan represent the Potawatomi. To the west were other native groups with long-standing residents in the region. To the southeast were native groups pushed westward into the Ohio region by Euro-American expansion. So we can see that the Anishinaabe were numerically predominant in the Great Lakes region. And although not shown on the map, most Anishinaabe lived in that region. We now fast forward to the next slide, to the 1930 map of US counties that we constructed from the US Census. Now the counties coded light green, and dark blue had more than 10 Anishinaabe in 1930. The native population in the light green were predominantly Anishinaabe, and the dark green counties were predominantly other natives, and the dark blue counties were mixed. In 1930, the Anishinaabe continued to be concentrated in the Great Lakes states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. In 1930, there were significant Anishinaabe along the Canadian border in North Dakota and Montana, very likely related to the Western expansion of the fur trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 1930s, the light green counties with majority Anishinaabe populations were concentrated along the Canadian border, with only 2 predominantly Anishinaabe counties south of Traverse City, Michigan. This map also shows an emptying of the Anishinaabe from the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and from the southern parts of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, largely a result of the ethnic cleansing of native populations from these areas during the 19th century. The Anishinaabe who were removed from the Great Lakes in the 19th century were largely relocated in what is now Kansas and Oklahoma. Many other Anishinaabe responded to this removal program by moving to Canada. The map also shows a general redistribution of population to such places as South Dakota, Montana, and Oregon, probably through such factors as education, family reasons, and job relocation. The next slide, please, Eric. We also used this 1930 county map to identify Anishinaabe county areas for 1900 to 1940. The Anishinaabe population in 1930 was very concentrated in certain counties. Most Anishinaabe lived in those counties. Few Anishinaabe lived in other counties, and few other natives lived in these Anishinaabe counties. This allowed us to assume that all natives in those counties were Anishinaabe, permitting identification of Anishinaabe in the censuses from 1900 to 1940. We now forward to a map again showing these Anishinaabe county areas. We included in the Anishinaabe county area all the predominantly Anishinaabe light green counties and the mixed dark blue counties, and excluded from the Anishinaabe county area the dark green counties with minority Anishinaabe populations. We also included in the Anishinaabe county area the counties coded purple and yellow that were geographically proximate to the Anishinaabe majority counties. We identified all natives living in these light green, dark blue, purple, and yellow counties as Anishinaabe, in our analyses of the 1900 to 1940 decennial censuses. I now shift to the National Native School Program of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I want us to keep some contextual things in mind about Native education. Natives have been educating their children since the beginning of time. That means that our group is only studying Euro-American education of Native children. In addition, missionaries have been trying to re-educate natives since soon after 1492. That is what missionary work is about. Next slide, Eric. The first systematic US government effort to organize schools for natives came in 1819 with the passage of the so-called Civilization Act. That act provided $10,000 per year for missionary societies to fund and operate schools. The first government-funded schools were in 1820, but they were only subsidies. Most of the funding came from the missionaries and the native groups themselves. I have several slides to show concerning this national program, the growth of schools and student enrollment, the variety of school types, and our data will exclude New York and the tribes originating in the Southeast for a couple of reasons. I'll begin here with a number of schools from 1819 through 1905. As you can see, the number increases from 1820 through the eve of the Civil War, when there were slightly more than 50 such schools. The number then declines during the Civil War, but then increases between 1870 and 1905 to more than 300 schools outside New York and the groups originating in the Southeast. Next slide. The next slide shows a similar trend for the number of Native students, increasing slowly to the Civil War and then increasing dramatically after 1970. This rapid increase in numbers extends all the way through 1938. We now shift our attention to the next slide. We move from the number of schools and students to the types of schools. When most people think of American Indian schools, they think of boarding schools. But there were many kinds of Native schools, with the three biggest categories being day, boarding, and standard neighborhood public schools. This slide shows the distribution of schools between boarding and day schools from 1877, the first year we have data, through 1905. Here we see that in 1877, there were actually more day schools than boarding schools. Both types of schools increased rapidly after 1877, but faster for boarding schools, with boarding schools becoming more numerous in subsequent decades. This next slide shows the number of students in the two types of schools from 1884 through 1932. Here we see that there are only slightly more boarding than day schools than day students in 1884. However, the number of day students stays fairly steady through 1932, whereas the number of boarding students increases rapidly through about 1900, when it also levels off. This next slide shows another common misunderstanding of American Indian schooling. Here, the dotted line is the combined number of Native students enrolled in day and boarding schools, with that number staying relatively steady from 1910 through 1932. However, the solid line in this graph introduces a new form of schools in 1910, the standard neighborhood public school, which was only introduced in any substantial numbers in 1911, when the BIA contracted some Native schooling out to standard neighborhood schools. This pattern expanded even further as students started attending standard neighborhood schools without BIA sponsorship. Next slide, Eric.
Bojo, Lindsey Willow Smith, Indigenica, Makonindodum. Hi, my name is Lindsey Willow Smith. I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians and also a member of Bear Clan. And I'm presenting some maps that show the location of Bureau of Indian Affairs schools through 1823 and 1848. Next slide, please. So this first map that we're looking at shows all of the schools that affected Anishinaabe students during this time. A few notes to make before I get deep into the data is that these maps only use BIA records, meaning that any schools not recorded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs are not included in this map. In addition, not every year between 1823 and 1848 was reviewed in creating this data. About every 5th year was reviewed, and this data is approximate in nature. So this first map shows all of the schools that Anishinaabe students attended during this time period. Anishinaabe schools being defined as any school that had at least one Anishinaabe student in a year review. And all of these schools, the majority of them are located around the Great Lakes region, as would be expected in reviewing those first maps of Anishinaabe counties, but there are also some that are more far-flung. There are a few in Kansas and Missouri reflecting removed Anishinaabe populations, as well as the school number 40 in Kentucky, Choctaw Academy, that some Anishinaabe students attended over the years. The second map that we're reviewing is just a zoomed in version of the first map to focus on the Great Lakes region. Shows that the vast majority of schools attended by Anishinaabe populations were located on the coastlines of Great Lakes. The trend in this data shows that the majority of schools started in the southern part of the state of Michigan and moved north eventually along the coastline. There are some outliers to this, such as the school in Sault Ste. Marie, the school in Mackinac, and the school at Keweenaw Bay. But for most schools, they began in the southern part of the state and moved north and moved inland. Moving to the third map that I have, this just shows an example of the data that was recorded on each school. So in this example, it is the school at Grand Traverse Bay, which was in operation from approximately 1848, keeping in mind that not every year was reviewed, until at least 1848, given that 1848 was the last year that data was reviewed for this data set. In addition, the religion of Presbyterianism was recorded, as most of these schools were religious in nature. Going on to the charts that I created reflecting this data, this first chart shows Anishinaabe schools started by year. As Arland mentioned previously, the first schools came in 1820 under the Civilization Act, and in the early 1820s, not many schools were starting, but by the mid to late 1830s and 1840s, several schools were starting each time period. On the next chart, we can see that while not a lot of schools were starting in the 1820s, the ones that were continued to exist. So this chart shows Anishinaabe schools in existence by year, meaning that they are the total count of Anishinaabe schools. In the 1820s, not many were starting each year, but the ones that were staying in existence, while the ones that were starting in the 1840s may not have been in existence for as long, keeping in mind the fact that 1848 was the last year reviewed. To use the year 1842, for example, 22 schools were in existence that year, and 16 of them had been created that year. Chimigwach for your time, and on to the next presenter, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Linda Young-DeMarco, and I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of Anishinaabe literacy and school attainment using data from the 1900 to 1940 censuses. Next slide. The data files were obtained from IPMS at the Minnesota Population Center, and included in the analyses are people enumerated in the 1900 through 1940 censuses who were living in one of the county areas we identified as being primarily Anishinaabe and whose race was recorded in the census as Indian. Next, please. Questions about a person's ability to read and or write were asked in the 1900 through 1930 federal decennial censuses, and this information was collected about all individuals who were 10 years of age or older. Ability to read and or write in any language counted. Next. The percent of Anishinaabe recorded as literate during this time period increased steadily across these decades, from around 45% in 1900 to over 80% in 1940. Next, please. The percent literate was always lower in rural areas than in urban, but the gap between rural and urban closed steadily across time. Next. Now this graph pools all Anishinaabe from 1900 to 1930 together and then categorizes them into 19 groups according to which year they were born. These groups are called birth cohorts. The oldest people are grouped into the cohort labeled 1830/earlier, and the next oldest group are within the cohort labeled 1881 through 1885, and so forth, until we end with the youngest group of people, which is seen on the far right-hand side of the scale, labeled 1916 through 20. In this interpretation, we see a steady increase across birth cohorts in the percentage of Anishinaabe reporting that they were literate, with 14%, the lowest percentage of all, reported by those born in 1830 or earlier, and the highest, 96%, reported by those in the youngest cohort, 1916 through 1920. Next slide, please. Next, I'll talk briefly about the highest grade of school or year of college completed by Anishinaabe enumerated in the 1940 census. This is the first time such a question was asked in the census. We'll look at Anishinaabe ages 25 and older, since they will be most likely to have finished their education by that age. Next, please. Here we see very little difference between men and women relative to how much schooling was completed in 1940. Only around 15% reported not completing any schooling. The largest percentage of people, around 30%, were categorized as completing 7th through 8th grades, and after that, the percentages completing more than 8 grades fell sharply. Next, please. While 80% of Anishinaabe completed at least one grade of school, after that, the percentage completing subsequent levels of schooling became smaller as each level of attainment increased. Next, please. This waterfall is a nice illustration of school attainment using birth cohorts that I described earlier. The topmost line represents the youngest birth cohort, those born in 1911 through 15. For every category of school attainment listed at the points across the bottom scale, this cohort consistently has the highest percentage of people finishing at least that level of schooling. The next line beneath the youngest cohort is the 1906 through 1910 birth cohort, which has the second highest percentage. This pattern repeats itself as we move down line by line for each preceding 5-year birth cohort until we reach the oldest cohort on the bottom line, those born in 1860 or earlier, where the lowest percentage of grade level attainment is reported in all categories. Next. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Hemenway. I'm the Director of Archives and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. But first, I'd like to give a traditional introduction of myself to help keep my thoughts centered. Ganebik and Disnikas, Anam Tikamek and Donjiba, Anishinaabe, Odawa Indo, and Jijik Dodam, Jenagay Archives and Records for the Wagon Xing Odawak. One of my native names is the Snake. My English name is Eric Hemenway. I self-identify as an Anishinaabe Odawa. I am from the place of the Prayer Tree, aka Cross Village, Michigan, along the shores of Lake Michigan. And I am of the Crane Clan and Director of Archives and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, one of 12 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Michigan. So we'll discuss a little bit about school and school's attendance for the Wagon Xing Odawak. But first, most of you probably are not familiar with the Wagon Xing area, so here we are. This is Wagon Xing, my homeland. I'm very lucky I have a GIS department that I can work with where I send them data and they make me maps. So this is a very custom map of the Wagon Xing area. It's also aka Emmett County or Northern Lake Michigan. Wagon Xing has multiple translations. One of them is "It is bent" or "Land of the Crooked Tree," referring to a large bent tree that once stood near Optawang, or AKA Middle Village, AKA Goodhart. And this is where we're going to talk about education that went on with the population of the Odawa from this area, about the schools that were within this area. There was multiple types of schools that we're going to look at, but also how children from the Wagon Xing Odawa were sent to other schools outside of their immediate homelands. So we have the main villages of this area being Jingwak Zibing, Pine River, Charlevoix, Mukwa Zibing, Bear River, Petoskey, Wiikemkoong, Harbor Springs, aka Little Traverse, Small Bay Place, Onmatikamek, Cross Village, and then Optawang, Middle Village, Mikogenda, the Beaver Islands. And Odawa people are still living in all of these areas to this very day, and their kids are going to schools in this area to this very day in public schools. So the Odawa from Wagon Xing are no strangers to early Western education. As Arland stated previously, we've been educating our family and our community since time immemorial, but this took a major shift after the War of 1812, when the war was concluded in 1815, and the civilization policies were bearing down on all Native people in the United States, including the Odawa. We had to make shifts very quickly in terms of educating our youth. Many of these early schools within Wagon Xing were joint ventures between the community and the church, and these are known as mission schools, not to be confused with Indian boarding schools. And these mission schools were adjacent to these different denominations, whether it's Presbyterian or Catholic. And we had one of these schools start very early in 1829 at Harbor Springs, the little Holy Childhood. It started as a mission school. But also the education of the Odawa youth went in a little bit further during the early 1820s. 3 Odawa youth were sent to a seminary school in Cincinnati. And this was done to meet the challenges that were coming to our community, particularly in removal. The Indian removal was a federal policy. My community was targeted for removal in the 1830s. Our community seen this was going to happen. So one of the tools that they used to combat this policy of removal was Western education, that we needed youth who could read and write and understand this new type of language and thinking. So they sent some of the best and brightest to the seminary school in Cincinnati. And then we also had mission schools on Mackinac Island, which is very close to Wagon Xing in the 1820s and 40s. And then, 2 youth went even a step further in the 1820s that were at that seminary school, and they studied to be priests at the Propaganda dei Fidi at the Vatican in Rome, Italy, like the Vatican. So we had 2 youth go to Rome, Augustine Hamlin Jr., aka Kanapima, and then William Blackbird. William died while he was at Rome, and then Augustine came back immediately afterwards, after his cousin's death. They were there about 3 years, and Augustine would come back, and he would actually be very instrumental in fighting to have the Odawa stay in Michigan, because he was the head interpreter for 2 major treaties for the Odawa, the Treaty of 1836 and of Washington, D.C. in 1855 of Detroit. And he could read and write in several languages, particularly English. So without him being at the treaty negotiations, we very well may have been removed to Kansas or Oklahoma. But then we also had government schools in the 1880s that were day schools. Students would go there for the day and return home when the day was concluded. One of these schools was at Middle Village, right in the heart of Wagon Xing in the 1880s. It was sporadic. It only ran a few years. But we also had public schools and one-room schoolhouses that were in operation in Wagon Xing from 1870s and 1950s. And I actually attended one of these schools. The Cross Village Public School is a one-room schoolhouse. So I'm not really that old, but the school just ran that much longer. So I went there until 6th grade. It was K through 6. And then from there, we went to Harbor Springs Public School, where I graduated in 1995. But Indian education took a major shift in the 1880s. And under the federal policy of civilizing natives, the policy took a hard turn that we're going to focus our attention on children. And the Indian boarding school system was created to assimilate and civilize, quote unquote, native children, native populations. And the vast majority of Odawa children attended federal boarding schools between 1886 and 1934. And this is just the data that I've been able to collect thus far. There's much more data out there, but there was over 360 Indian boarding schools throughout the United States. From what we've gathered so far, we know that Wagon Xing Odawa children went to these schools. They went to the Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School in Harbor Springs, Michigan, which was one of the last Indian boarding schools to close in the country. It closed its doors in 1983. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, the Tomah Industrial Indian School, Tomah, Wisconsin, the Haskell Industrial Training School, Haskell, Kansas, Genoa Indian Industrial School, Genoa, Nebraska, and Chilocco Indian Industrial School in Newkirk, Oklahoma. So this is what we know so far of where the Odawa kids from Wagon Xing went to. And the time they spent at these schools varied. Some Odawa children went to multiple boarding schools. For example, they would transfer from Holy Childhood to Carlisle, Carlisle to Mount Pleasant. But the two schools that had the largest attendance were Holy Childhood and Mount Pleasant. So in this graph, we're going to show actually the three schools that had the largest Odawa attendance. And this is Carlisle, Holy Childhood, and Mount Pleasant. And you can see, that there are steady numbers and the spikes come in, especially for Holy Childhood between 1892 and 1895, of almost 200 kids attending Holy Childhood. And at this time period, there's roughly 3,000 Odawa that are accounted for. So this is all of our kids are going to these schools. And we also see, this Mount Pleasant school having, a fair attendance numbers of Odawa children. It dips later in the early 20th century, but Holy Childhood is consistent. It has large numbers. And then Carlisle also has low but steady numbers until its closure in 1928. But you can see that this is where all of our kids are going predominantly during this time period. So we did some comparison of the public schools, and this is data from the two largest public schools in Wagon Xing, or AKA Emmett County, and this is Harbor Springs and Petoskey. And we went through and gathered data from the graduating classes between 1887 and 1949 for these two schools. And it's a pretty telling story that there are hardly any Odawa graduating from these schools. You can see the Harbor Springs graduates, many times it's 0, 1 or 2. And in Petoskey, it's not much more. And you can see the number of non-native graduates, is quite high, up to 90, 80 at Petoskey. And then in Harbor Springs, we have, 30s, peaks at 40, and so on and so forth. But the number of Odawa graduates are very low. And in comparison to the boarding school numbers, it tells a story of where all these kids are. They're at the boarding schools. And how these children ended up at the boarding schools is a very complex story. We're still figuring out. There's a lot of social services where kids would be taken out of their homes, placed into schools. And there was also a large social pressure to go to these schools. And it was also expected that if you're Indian, you go to the Indian school. And so there's a lot of mechanisms on how children ended up at these schools. And also during the Great Depression, that a lot of Odawa families were struggling to make ends meet. And a solution for many families just to feed the families was to send their kids to the boarding schools. So the boarding school is a very complicated story that I tread lightly on because, we have survivors who attended Holy Childhood because it's such late closure. It's an anomaly for many boarding schools. Like I said, there was over 360 schools across the country, and Holy Childhood was one of the latest to close. And this is a photo from 1890, and picture says 1,000 words. Some of these kids were as young as 4 years old that went to these schools, and the experiences varied from student to student. Some students reported having favorable experiences, while many students had very devastating, very traumatizing experiences. But I want to focus not on the survivors because that's their story to tell, but the system that was created to take these kids out of their families and communities and essentially make them non-native. Their language was prohibited, their customs, their tradition, their religion was all prohibited. And there was often very severe repercussions for breaking the rules, beatings, isolations, restrictions with visitations, and a lot of kids never made it back from the schools. They passed away at the schools, and we're seeing this out of Canada in the last year, where these large number of kids, burials of students have been discovered, but that's here as well within the United States, where these kids pass at these schools and they're buried around the schools. And this is from the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School, where hundreds of Odawas went through this school through its entire existence. This school was not run by a denomination. Holy Childhood was administered by the Catholic Church throughout its entire creation, and it was administered by the Franciscan Friars and Sisters of Notre Dame. Mount Pleasant wasn't this, it was an industrial government school, but still had a very heavy religious element, as all these schools did, because you could not, quote unquote, be civilized and be non-Christian. That just didn't mix. So you had to go to church and attend services and so on and so forth. But you can see the strict military type of atmosphere at these schools. Some of these kids would live at these schools for years on end. Some would go home after a year. Some would go as day students. This was a boarding school at Mount Pleasant, but Holy Childhood kids would go home at the end of the day sometimes. Some would live there, some would go home in the summer. So it varied from student to student, but without a doubt, the repercussions of these schools are felt every day of Native populations throughout North America, in terms of lack of culture, lack of language, and also just a large number of kids that never made it back home.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to conclude with some comments about the interrelationships of our two main topics, land and schools for Native Americans. The two overlapped in time as the 18th and 19th centuries brought horrific native land loss, and the 19th and 20th centuries witnessed the growth of schools. Native land and schools were also linked in the minds of many Euro-Americans who asserted that schools were partial compensation to natives for the land they were losing, and also helped natives to live in a Euro-American world. Many Native Americans also saw schools as a mechanism for adjustment to the Euro-American world. These land and school connections were enshrined in more than 300 unequal treaties in the 19th century, where it was frequently stated that schools and teachers were compensation for land. Growing out of this were hundreds of Native schools and many thousands of Native students, learning reading, writing, arithmetic, agriculture, animal husbandry, and domestic skills. In many cases at great cost in terms of separation from families and communities, coercion and abuse, high rates of morbidity and mortality, and suppression of identities, language, and beliefs. Important for us here at the University of Michigan is that the treaties signed at Fort Meigs on the Maumee River in present-day Toledo by the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and their neighbors in 1817 was the first treaty to mention establishing a school. It was also the first treaty to mention resources for a college, stating that some Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi wished their children to go to college. These Anishinaabe elders granted land to the college at Detroit, which later became the University of Michigan. The second and last treaty to mention a college occurred about 5 decades later, when a group of Odawa Anishinaabek, who had been removed from the Great Lakes to Kansas in the 1830s, were being uprooted again, this time to Oklahoma. They provided land to a fledgling new college named Ottawa University. And I remind you of what Eric mentioned when he said that earlier in the 1820s, there was a group of Odawa from Wagon Xing who traveled to Rome for schooling then. This kind of commitment to education by the Anishinaabe and their neighbors seems to me to merit the utmost of honor and dedication by those of us who are here at the University of Michigan. I thank you for your attention, your time. We're now ready to move on to the question and answer period. And I invited you when we started to insert your questions. I'll go to those questions. And I'd be happy for you to go ahead and put into the Q&A section just below your screen, and put in other questions if you would like. So the first question says literacy. Anishinaabe might have been literate in their oral traditions, et cetera, but didn't really have a written language until much later. So I presume literate means in language other than their own. Correct?
I think by and large, yeah, that's true. I've looked a little bit at the particular languages that people were literate in, and it's mainly European languages.
Okay, thank you. Our next one, I have you down here, Steve. Did you have a question, Steve? I'll come back if you do. Next question is, thank you for the presentation. Can you recommend resources for reading if I am interested to know more about resilience of the children who attended boarding school? Anybody want to answer that one? In terms of resilience, one of my favorite books on boarding schools is a book by Coleman. I'm not remembering the first name, who spends a fair amount of time on talking about the resilience issue.
There's a book called, they called it Prairie Light, that I found to be really great. It's about the Chilocco boarding school.
Yeah, thank you. That's the boarding school that was in Oklahoma. Another question, has the University of Michigan been living up to its responsibilities under the treaty signed? I heard that we have not waived tuition for the last few years.
Well, as a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, I've been able to attend the University of Michigan due to the payments made by my ancestors through the Michigan Indian tuition waiver. However, there are a lot of stipulations. You can just search the term Michigan Indian tuition waiver and find a PDF of the required form that I've filled out every year to be able to attend here, and see the information required, which is minimum 25% blood quantum, enrollment in a tribe, and some other factors. So tuitions are still being waived as long as several stipulations are being met.
Thank you, Lindsey. The next question, I think if I've managed to stay in order, is I was late as I had another commitment. Is the recording and/or PowerPoints available? This was incredibly informative. Miigwech. It's my, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this, and it will be put up on the website of the Institute for Social Research. And it should be up there next week. Next question I have, were the Sault Ste. Marie schools all on the mainland or on Sugar Island?
So in the research that I found, there were always multiple schools in the Sault Ste. Marie area. Most of them tended to be on the mainland, but some of them were recorded very vaguely, keeping in mind this data does come from documents from the 1820s that suggest they may have been on Sugar Island.
Thank you. I have a invitation from Sandy Momper, who says, if the person who asked the question about resilience emails me, I have access to resilience information via doctoral student who did a dissertation on this. So feel free to contact Professor Momper, who will be happy to give you the information that she has. The next question here is, do you see this research continuing and in what ways? I will preface an answer to that by saying that there is much more material available to research than I had ever imagined. But at the same time, it's skimpy in terms of detail, and there's lots of reasons to have a fair amount of respect for the lack of precision and the lack of accuracy at some points. But we are continuing to put together materials on the number of students. I showed you some graphs on the number of schools and the number of students, and we're continuing to work on that. Lindsey worked on the first part of the Anishinaabe period when she covered from 1823 to 1848. Our plan is we hope to have the time and the resources to push that on closer to the present. There's a lot happened after 1848, and we would like to push it on. So yes, we are planning to continue this line of work. And there's also, I might add, so Eric mentioned that in Wagon Xing there were lots of boarding schools being attended, and he's been able to put together information on several of them. But we would like to extend that further to other schools. And if we could come closer to the present, that would be nice too. My watch says that we're a couple of minutes from needing to end. And I was just going to ask if there was one more question. I just got another entry into the Q&A. And this is more of a comment than a question. And this comment says, well, most of us students and alumni do not know about the role of Native Americans in the founding of the University of Michigan. I think that the administration ought to place a monument to the Odawa people somewhere in a prominent place in the central campus, maybe in front of Angel Hall or in front of the University of Michigan Museum of Art. It is essential that students and alumni learn how the U of M came to be. Sorry, this is not a question. Let me add one more couple of sentences to that. There is a plaque on campus that sits exactly on a line between the graduate library and Rackham. It's between sidewalks. You sort of have to look for it. When I looked for it, it took me a fair amount of time, but I did find it. It's a nice plaque. It does have the story of the 1817 treaty that gave a plot of land to the university that was starting in Detroit, which became our University of Michigan. So I would encourage you to stop by and have a look at that. It's just north of the flagpole. With that, let me thank you for your time and your attention in coming. We appreciate it. We believe this is an important topic, and we're excited on continuing to research it. So thank you.